Hi, I'm Carmen Agra Deedy, Cuban American storyteller and author of books for young readers. And the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress has invited me to be part of their 2020 Homegrown at Home concert series. At home. So instead of being in Washington, D.C., I'm coming to you today from my home in Georgia. Now, the American Folklife Center will continue to release a new video every Wednesday at noon East Coast time from now until September 30th. And each artist will be live in the chat section to answer questions. So be sure and stop in and say hi. After the videos are released, you can still access them on the library's website or YouTube channel. See you there. My father learned to read when he was 14 years old. And that's the story I want to tell you today. But before I tell it to you, I would like to introduce you to the man by way of a little vignette. Now, this happened some 20 years ago. I'd stopped in their house, and I stopped at their house on a whim. I was working nearby, and they lived in Austell, Georgia, a good 45 minutes from my house then in Tucker. It was a little clapboard house, and they were both retired, and I was happy to see them. I was hoping they'd be happy to see me, and of course, I was also hoping to cash in on a good Cuban meal, because my mother was a fabulous cook. Well, that screen door is still slamming, and I have just walked into the kitchen when my mother comes at me with the full force of a Cuban hurricane. Tienes que hacer algo. You have to do something. I said, hello to you too, Ma. No, tu padre, your father. I thought, oh, no. No matter what age you are, you do not want to be in the middle of their business when your parents have a disagreement. Whatever it is, I don't. Pero Carmen, she interrupts me. Se ha vuelto loco. He has lost his mind. And I hear a syncopated tick-tick, tick-tick, tap, tap, tap of my father's Remington typewriter a couple of rooms away. And I said, all right, now I'm intrigued. Let me go see what's up. Ya verás, you will see. I disappear down the hall, and I find my father in the bedroom. And what is he doing? He is sitting at his desk in front of his typewriter. The Webster's Dictionary at his right, open about a fifth of the way, and the man is transcribing the dictionary. I said, Puppy, what are you doing? What does it look like I am doing? He keeps tapping. Puppy, it looks, and I look over his shoulder, and that's exactly what he's doing. It looks like you are copying the dictionary. Yes. Ma thinks you've lost your mind. He starts to laugh. He swivels on his chair, looks at me, and he says, Carmen, I want to learn English. I said, you speak English, Pop? No. I want to learn to speak English well. And you cannot learn a language if you do not have good vocabulary. And how better way, How better way? How better way to learn a language than to, I looked at him, transcribe the dictionary. Oh, my stars. Pop, this is going to take you ages. I know. What else do I have to do? And it has the added bonus. He swivels back and starts to tap again. And he says over his shoulder, of making your mother insane. Well, when he says that, he starts to laugh and his little shoulders start to dance up and down. And of course, I start to laugh, at which point we hear from the kitchen, I can hear you. I can hear you both. Okay. My father wasn't just a writer, because besides transcribing the dictionary, which has become one of the signature stories of my father's life among the children and grandchildren, they just love that story. They knew that my father was just a man with a curious mind. He loved not only dictionaries, he loved atlases and he loved encyclopedias. He was a reader, but more than that, he was someone who loved to learn. He wasn't always this way. Before he became a writer, now he was never published. He did it for the pure joy of the thing. But first he had to be a reader. And that's the story I'm going to tell you now. My Cuban father, Carlos Agra, was born in 1924 during the nascent years of the Cuban Depression. During those years, he lived on a farm with my grandmother and his siblings, and those were treacherous times. People lived, he said, on the edge of a scalpel. Starvation was a real possibility. My grandmother was just able to keep one meal on the table for all those children. And when my father was 6, which would have been around 1930, she sent him to school as his siblings had gone to school. However, Papi said the mind-numbing days and stinging yardstick were not his cup of, as he put it, café con leche. And so one day, he emancipated himself. This newly liberated 6-year-old stopped going to school, but of course did not tell my abuela, my grandmother, his mother. In fact, every morning she would take a little kerchief and she would wrap up a little bit of Cuban bread or a croqueta or a little empanada, and he would tool off to school down the dirt road. She would watch him go around the bend, and then he would run off into la selva, the Cuban jungle. He said that his days were marvelous. And those of you listening to this little recording, who perhaps for maybe it was just sheer happenstance, maybe it was luck, but you have actually sipped from the cup of a feral childhood. You know what joy was his, because all he did was play all day long, and he was mischievous. He said he would chase guinea hens. He would raid mango groves in other people's farms. When he was exhausted at the end of the day, he would go down to El Rio, the river, the place he could always find solace. And there this 6-year-old would strip naked in the sun, go diving into the water, swim until he was worn out, and then he would crawl up the bank and lie on the flat rocks, as he put it, como un lagarto en el sol, like a lizard in the sun, and often fall asleep, though he said inevitably, or nearly always anyway, he would wake up right about the time the school was out. And on his way home, he would stop and crouch by the road near the schoolhouse, take from his pockets little river rocks that he had collected during his swim, and wait for his erstwhile teacher to come down the road as he made his way into Florida, the little town where my father was from, to the boarding house, and my father would pelt this man with pebbles and rocks. Well, be sure your sins will find you out, because my father's hooliganism and chronic truancy eventually came to the attention of my abuela, my grandmother Ofelia. And when she spoke to him, she brooked no argument. O vas a la escuela, or you go to school, o trabajas en la finca, or you work here. No me importa que tengas 6 años. I don't care that you're 6 years old. You have a choice. What 6-year-old would choose school, especially a school he had not enjoyed, to being on the farm and working? And he was the baby. No one made him work for years. He just followed his siblings around, or he followed his mother around, and he did one small task or another. But the years passed, and by the time he was 14, his list of chores had grown quite long. But he didn't seem to mind most of them, if his stories are to be believed. He said there was only one job he loathed with a deep and abiding antipathy. And that was this one job. That was getting up in the morning before the sun had come up. My abuela would give him some café con leche, a little coffee with milk and a little sugar, to fortify him. And then this was the part that he really, really despised. Not the getting up in the morning, in the dark, not the long walk over 1 kilometer into Florida, into the little town. No, it was the task. See, what he was to do every morning was walk into the bakery, La Panaderia, in that little town of Florida, and buy the family's bread for the day. And Cuban bread is a staple of Cuban life. Why did he hate it? Because the bakery was run by Antonio, and evidently this ill-tempered man would soon curse you as look at you, and my father was terrified of him. And this irascible baker was also the only place to get bread, because it was the only bakery. Papi said he would wait outside until he saw a few other people arrive, and then he would sort of join a smallish crowd, slip his coin onto the wooden counter, wait till he saw a loaf of bread, snatch it, and run home. Until the next day when he had to go through this all over again. But then, one day, a chance encounter with El Príncipe Valiente, that's Prince Valiant, was to change the trajectory of my father's life. Papi was late. He'd overslept. And so he was late arriving at the bakery. And when he got there, the last person walked out and he was left alone with Antonio. But Antonio didn't notice him. The man had just opened up the newspaper across that wooden counter, and Papi saw a look on his face that was so extraordinary in the fact that it was so unlikely, so unusual. The man was, could it be? Well, the corners of his mouth, Papi said, were inching towards his earlobes. He was baring his teeth, and as my father put it, it would be criminal to call it a smile, but it must have been, because then the man laughed, and my father had never heard that sound come from this particular human. And I don't know what my father did or said, but Antonio noticed him then. Maybe Papi gasped, "Yay, ven acá, niño, ven acá," seemingly congenial for the first time ever. Antonio called my father over. He took the newspaper, he turned it around so Papi could look at it, and as my father, my young, slender, 14-year-old father, 14-year-old illiterate father, looked down at the paper, he couldn't make heads or tails of any of the language. The words, the letters to him looked like chicken scratchings, he said. But he saw something that absolutely grabbed his attention and enraptured him in an instant. Comics. He'd never seen it. This was newly syndicated. These comics had come from the U.S. to Havana, and now they had been syndicated to small papers throughout the island. And my father looked down at El Príncipe Valiente, Prince Valiant. He had no idea what he was looking at. It was a big box, and in the box there were smaller sections, and inside of those were renderings, were drawings. But there were women and men doing things he'd never seen. Medieval jousting. At one point in the drawings, there was a man being dipped into a well and everyone was laughing. Whatever it was, Antonio must have thought was hilarious. Because he said, "Viste que cómico, did you see? How hysterical." Well, do you think my father was going to tell Antonio that he couldn't read? Instead, he excused himself saying, "Yes, he's great, but mi madre me espera. My mother is waiting for me. I have to run." He handed over his coin, he grabbed his bread, and he was gone. But Papi said that night, those images made of his brain a kerosene fire. He could not extract meaning no matter how hard he tried. Of course, he had no cultural reference, and he couldn't read the words, he couldn't decode, and he made a decision. That boy made a decision the next morning to get up early, and he entered La Panaderia, the bakery, while Antonio was just laying out the day's bread, before anyone arrived. And he approached him evidently with fear and trepidation, but he approached Antonio and said, "Permiso, excuse me?" Antonio looked at him and said, "Un momento, no, por favor, please, would you read the funny pictures to me?" He said Antonio cast him a strange glance, as if to say, "Such a big boy, you can't read." But when the glance went unanswered, Antonio shrugged and said, "Claro, of course." This contrary man, the last thing my father expected was for him to agree. And they started that day. He read him the new comic strip. And so these trysts became a morning thing. Every morning my father would arrive early. Antonio would read him El Príncipe Valiente, and my father would buy his bread. He said sometimes the man was in an ill humor, sometimes he was more pleasant, but he kept his word. And that would be the end of the story. Those trysts would have gone on for a while, or they would have ended, one party or the other giving in to boredom or discontent. Those of you that have had trysts know what I'm talking about. But that's not what happened, because real stories always have that unexpected dog-leg turn. You see, my father arrived one morning at La Panaderia, and from a distance he could see the smoke. Tendrils of it coming out of the windows, the front door, and other shopkeepers had gathered around, outside and inside. Now, everyone had helped. The fire had been put out. It was a wood-burning stove, and there was not that much damage, but el pan, the bread, the day's bread, was ruined. Now, this is during the Depression, and Antonio was in a blistering fury. So when my father walked in, about to offer to help, to help clean up whatever he needed. Antonio saw him, and true to his nature, the man saw my father, and what he saw there was collateral damage. My father became, I should say, collateral damage. Antonio said, ¿Y qué tú haces aquí, muchacho? What are you doing here, boy? ¿Tú crees que hoy yo te voy a leer a ti? Do you think I'm going to read to you today? ¿Tú no has visto la tragedia que me ha caído a mí? Have you not seen the tragedy that has fallen on my head? Ven acá, chico, ¿por qué tú no puedes leer tan sangandongo? And anyway, why can't you read, such a big boy like you? All of this was said in the presence of my father's friends and neighbors. And so my father said he backed away at first through the crowd, and the crowd obligingly opened. People looked at the floor as he passed. He turned around and then he ran. He ran out of that village. He ran to El Rio, the river. You know, that place he could always find comfort, find solace. He didn't swim, though. He flung himself on those rocks and he sobbed. I don't think there's anything more heartrending than a 14-year-old boy racked with grief and with shame. You see, he was too ashamed to go back to the bakery to get the bread, too ashamed to go home to his mother, my abuela, and tell her what had happened, too ashamed to even tell his friends. But time passed. He wiped his tears. And shame, like milk left out in the sun, will curdle. And in the case of shame, it becomes rage if it's left unattended. And it must have been a very angry boy who walked the edges of the river, picking up little vengeful river rocks. He filled his pockets with them. And by the time he made it back to La Panaderia, the bakery in Florida, it was time for siesta. It was quiet in the streets and even quieter in the bakery. No one was there but Antonio. Antonio, who had been at work and now was fast asleep. Behind him, on the shelves, was row upon row of freshly baked and fragrant Cuban bread. You could smell it even when you walked in. More pungent than that leftover acrid smell of the burnt bread. Below those shelves, in a chair, Antonio snored softly, his chin resting on his clavicle. My father said he eyed him, and then he took a few steps across the floor, and then one of those boards betrayed him. Antonio was up in a flash. He was up and he shook his whole body from his head all the way down to his feet as if he was having a seizure. Suddenly, completely awake, he looked at my father. His eyes bored into him like two augers. And he said, ¿Y por qué tú no puedes leer, niño? And why can't you read? As if the conversation had never been interrupted. My father was too stunned to speak. But he held his ground. And he put his hands in his pockets again. And he wrapped them around those rocks. Antonio came closer and he said, "Didn't your mother send you to school?" My father looked at him. "She tried, and leave my mother out of it." And there they were, staring at one another. And Antonio said, in not a particularly friendly fashion, mind you, either, "Do you want to learn?" My father looked at him and said, "Not if it's going to turn me into an angry jackass like you." And Antonio threw his head back, and Papi said the man began to laugh, and when he laughed, he brayed like a donkey. He must have laughed, my father said, for a full minute, and at last, he looked at my father and shook his head and said, "Está bien, very good. That was fair. But, mijo, my boy, I see only two paths before you. Either you learn to read, well, either you don't learn to read." And he changed the direction he was going. "You don't learn to read, and you will be at the mercy of anyone who can read, who wants or doesn't want, or on a whim says no when you need something interpreted for you that's written. Or you do learn to read." And now he got really close to my father. He leaned down and he said, "And if you learn to read, you will never again be at the mercy of another angry jackass." And my father's answer was to have generational repercussions. Teach me. Enséñame. Teach me. They began the next morning. And after that, they had lessons every day, along with reading the comics. Now Antonio was teaching him the sound of each letter. My father remembers the day when he realized, and of course it made me think of Helen Keller, but in hearing him tell the story, it was so genuine. He said there was a day when Antonio wrote M-A-M-A on a piece of paper. And my father sounded out mama. And he said in that instant, he realized that those scratches, those symbols, wholly and completely encompassed the person who was at home waiting for him to bring the bread. After that, he said he was unstoppable. They went from the comics to the more interesting sort of advertisements for salves and lotions and washboards. And he said, and before we knew it, I was reading those beautiful, colorful obituaries. And he said that his mind became illuminated in a strange way that he said, I could never explain, Carmen. He did say this, it was not that as an illiterate boy, I did not have stories. Do not think because someone cannot read and write that they do not have an entire, and he beat his chest, entire universe inside of them. But there were things I would never know. And when I realized I could know them, well, then he said he read the backs of iodine bottles. He said he read letters stamped on the head of a nail. He suddenly noticed where on different shops words were written across the windows. And I remember hearing this story as a young woman and interrupting him and saying, Papi, you have to explain something to me. You are one of the most curious humans I've ever known. Why didn't you ask someone to teach you how reading worked? Before this, one of your siblings, your mother, someone would have taught you. He said, well, no one had time for that, he said. But more importantly, I suppose, I thought I'd lost my chance. And then my father said something to me that at that moment was very important because I was just entering school visits as an author and working increasingly with children on the margins of literacy. Papi looked at me and it was the eyes of a child. I could almost see the boy he was. He said, Carmita, I was a poor boy from a poor family during the Depression. I thought I had lost my chance when I did not go to school. And at this point, well, like new shoes and shiny toys, I did not believe the written word belonged to me. When I heard those words, it was like the tumblers in a lock falling into place with a click, click, click. And I realized that was it. That was it. If you do not believe that reading, that the written word is something that belongs to you or your family or your culture, decoding is hard work. Reading is hard work. But my father came to believe it. And he was unstoppable from there on. And because he became this inveterate reader, I became a reader. And my children became readers, and my grandchildren go to bed reading books. Their rooms are filled with books. They go to bed book drunk. As for my father, his reading soon led to writing. And when he came to the U.S. as a refugee, he wrote many stories, and I imagine they were a form of therapy, but they were more than that. I think he had the soul of a writer. And I suspect he was probably dyslexic, as is his daughter. But when he died 3 years ago, he left something particularly poignant. I found it after he died. My papi, who was illiterate until he was 14, left his memoir. Typewritten, of course, on that old typewriter. And throughout it, there are notations in my hand because page after page of what could have been a very clinical story of where he was born and what happened, and page after page is filled with stories. And that's the story of how a young boy became a reader, thanks to a cranky old baker. Thank you for listening today, and be sure to check out the American Folklife Center's website, where you will find a compendium of amazing sound recordings that you can listen to at your leisure. The address is www.loc.gov/folklife. That's www.loc.gov/folklife. See you there.